welcome. Thanks for coming on a beautiful Veterans Day. Happy Veterans Day. And welcome to our Symposium on Executive Power today, sponsored by the Social Sciences Department at Robert Morris. So we've got a great lineup of speakers, and we're going to jump right in. I'm going to introduce our first speaker this morning. Sharece is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Pittsburgh. She did her PhD in politics at Princeton University, concentrating on American politics. Her dissertation was entitled Presidential Power and Judicial Constraint, and focused on how the president considers potential court action when deciding how to exercise signing statements, executive orders, and agency rulemaking. She's currently expanding this work by collecting data on gubernatorial executive orders and state agency rulemaking in the 50 states. So it's a very important and topical subject we're excited to hear more about. Professor Thrower.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Professor Harold, for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. As Professor Harold mentioned, I study presidential power. I study a lot of different tools of the president. And today we're going to talk about a lesser-known tool, presidential signing statements. But before we talk about what a signing statement is, I just want to review and talk about how a bill becomes a law. And so I'm going to show you the stereotypical Schoolhouse Rock video just as a refresher, so you can remember, how a bill becomes a law. Pay attention to exactly what the president can do, because I'm going to quiz you on that afterwards.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
I hope that song gets stuck in your head for the rest of the day. So how many of you actually remember this video? I was just thinking, is this, oh good, I was hoping that you guys weren't too young to remember and I wasn't gonna date myself. Okay, so the lesson that we draw from this, and I wanted you to understand, is what the president can do after, all right. Oh, I don't think it's on. I don't know how to use this. So after a bill is passed by Congress, and Congress passes the bill onto the president's desk, what exactly can the president do? And President Obama's looking exactly at you, and he's saying, what can I do with this bill on my desk? So he has two options, and I have this chart up here. After Congress passes a bill, the president can sign the bill, and he likes the bill, he signs the bill, and that bill actually becomes part of the law. Or the president can veto the bill. And then after the president vetoes the bill, if Congress has a large enough majority, 2/3, it can override the president's veto and the bill becomes a law anyway. Or if it doesn't have high enough numbers, then Congress does not have the ability to override that veto, and then that law is completely rejected. So basically, the president has the power to either sign the bill and accept it the way it is, it becomes law, or reject the bill with a veto. So the question really boils down to veto or not to veto. That is the question. Except, is that really the question? Does the president have any more options? This is the way I'm asking the question. The answer is yes, he does have more options, and this is what we're going to talk about today. So back to this chart. After the Congress passes the bill and the president signs the bill, I told you before that the bill becomes a law. Well, before that, the president has the option of signing the bill with a signing statement. How many of you have ever heard of the term signing statement, just to get an idea? Okay, some. How many of you actually know what it means? 1, 2, 3. Okay, some of the older people in the room, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to tell you now exactly what a signing statement is. So, when the president passes a bill, when the Congress passes a bill and the bill is on the president's desk and the president signs that bill into law, the president has the option of writing an official written pronouncement that goes along with that bill. And in this pronouncement, he can talk about the things that he likes about the bill, talk about the things he doesn't like about the bill. But the basic definition is a signing statement is an official written pronouncement that the president issues when he's signing a bill into law. And there are a lot of different functions of signing statements to get an idea of why exactly the president does this. One, the president can provide just general comments on the bill with the signing statements. He can also either state his support or opposition of the bill. He can say, these are the things I like about the bill, these are the things I don't like about the bill. As a result, with the president issuing this statement when he's signing a bill into law, he's bringing attention to that bill. And maybe he wants to do that because he wants to draw certain attention to certain aspects of the bill. So that's another benefit of signing statements. Again, he can highlight what the bill does, some of the benefits of the bill, some of the good things the bill does, and maybe some of the shortcomings of the bill, some of the things he would have liked to seen, some of the things that he doesn't like about the bill. Even further, the president can provide objections to the bill that he just signed. He can say, I don't like this section, I object to this section, I don't agree with this section of the law that he just signed, mind you. Even a step further, and now we're getting into some of the controversial parts of signing statements. Not only can the president object to certain sections of the bill, but he can also vow that he's not going to listen to those sections. He can say, I object to sections A, B, and C, and as a result, I'm going to not follow these sections. I'm going to say that I am not bound to follow these certain sections. A lot of the times, he's going to say, Congress says this in the bill, well, I'm going to offer a different interpretation. I read it to mean this, instead of what Congress actually said. And one final step further, he can give instructions to the rest of the executive branch, telling them exactly how he wants them to implement that bill. So when Congress passes a bill into law, the executive branch is responsible for implementing that law. And oftentimes, Congress will give a set of instructions to the executive branch about how they want them to implement this law. And oftentimes, the president with signing statements will say, I want you to actually implement it this way instead of what Congress says in the bill. So these are more of the controversial parts of signing statements, that basically the president can ignore the law and says that he reads it differently and pick and choose what parts of the law that he's going to listen to. Again, a law that the president is signing into law, from a bill into a law. Okay, and so this is, you probably don't have time to read it all, but this is a political cartoon. It's depicting how a bill becomes a law in a more pessimistic sort of way. It has a lot of other political hurdles that we're faced in our current political climate. If you notice in the bottom left-hand part, it says that the president also has this option of issuing a signing statement and saying that he won't enforce the law. So another hurdle and another step into this process of how a bill becomes a law. Something that was not in the video that I showed you, but something that is a political reality today for presidents. So there are 4 main questions that we're going to answer today. The first is, what is a signing statement, which I just answered a little bit, but I'm going to give you the different types of signing statements and lay them out and how the president uses them and give you some examples of what they look like. The second question is, who have used signing statements over time? So which presidents have used them? And we're going to see exactly where this started. The next question, why do presidents use signing statements? I gave you a little bit of an idea about that, but I'm going to show you exactly the implications of signing statements as well. And finally, sorry, I got a little crazy with the PowerPoint animations, but finally, we're going to answer when or how do presidents issue signing statements? So under what conditions are we more likely to see a signing statement occur? And we'll return, hopefully during this presentation, we'll answer all of these questions and then we'll return to them at the end. So let's talk about this first question. What are signing statements? I told you that these are official statements the president issues when he signs a bill into law. So generally, we think of 2 main types of signing statements: rhetorical statements and constitutional signing statements. I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them, but I'm going to focus mostly on the constitutional signing statements, because those of you that have heard of signing statements, when it's talked about in the media, most people talk about these constitutional signing statements. These are the ones that are a little bit more controversial, so these are the ones I'm going to focus more on. But I'm going to give you the definition of both of these types and some examples. So, a rhetorical signing statement. This is a statement the president issues, and the purpose of this type of signing statement is to target a particular constituency. So a particular group of people that he's targeting, and he wants to point out how the signing statement is going to benefit this particular group of people. This is a way for the president to gain some political support for the issue at hand, for the law that was just passed. It's a way for him to mobilize political support by telling a particular constituency, hey, this bill is good for you. So let me give you an example of this type of signing statements. So this is an example from a bill passed into law by Bill Clinton. He signed it October 20th, 1999. This is a bill Congress passed an appropriations bill, so basically to give money to these different departments. So the Department of Veteran Affairs and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And in this legislation, Congress created this program that was going to benefit low-income residents of different housing areas. And so it's basically a program to develop some housing in low-income areas. That's what it was. And the president issues a signing statement along with this piece of legislation. And in this signing statement, he's going to point out how great this program is and how great it's going to be for its low-income residents. So in the signing statement, he says this program is going to promote housing and economic development in low and moderate income areas. This is great. It's going to be great for distressed neighborhoods those residents are currently undeserved low-income residents. So as you can see, the president is saying, hey, this law is good for you. This law is good for those residents living in these low-income areas. It's going to be great for you. He's bringing positive attention to that piece of legislation. This is a way to kind of gain support behind this legislation. So this is a good thing the president is trying to point out. The second example of a rhetorical signing statement I'm going to show you is when President H.W. Bush signs the Energy Policy Act of 1992, when he signed that bill into law. And again, he's going to try to point out all of the benefits and all the ways that this law is going to be good for different constituencies and good for the people in general. So he starts off in saying that there's much of this law that's going to be good for America. So saying everyone's going to benefit from this. It's going to further competition, lower prices. You get to keep your hard-earned money. Everyone loves to hear that. It's going to be good for improving education, good for college students, all of you. And therefore, it's going to enrich all of our lives. So you see, he's kind of laying it on a little thick, right? That saying how great this bill is going to be for America, for college students, for everyone. You get to keep your money. So another way that signing statements just bring positive attention to the bill that the president is supporting. So I painted that was a rosy picture of signing statements that I just painted for you. Now we're going to focus on the more controversial use of signing statements. And so we're going to talk about the constitutional signing statements, that type of signing statements. So in this type of signing statement, the president uses this statement to object to certain sections of the law. He's saying, I do not agree with this part of the law, I object to this part of law, and these objections are based on the fact that the president is arguing that these sections violate the Constitution in some sort of way. So these objections are based on constitutional grounds. And as a result, the president is saying that I find these sections unconstitutional, and so as a result, I'm going to vow not to follow them. I'm going to vow to either ignore them or interpret them differently or have my executive branch implement them in a different way. But I don't agree with these sections because I think that they're unconstitutional. That's exactly what a constitutional signing statement does. And so there are three main types of objections based on the Constitution that the president makes in these sorts of signing statements. And all these objections, again, are going to be based on particular clauses in the Constitution. So for all these cases, these are all the clauses the president usually cites when he makes objections to the law in these signing statements. Let's go through a little bit of each of these. So the first objection the president usually makes is based on the Take Care Clause of the Constitution. The Take Care Clause is going to be in Article 2, Section 3, Clause 4 of the Constitution. And if you remember, Article 2 is the part of the Constitution that lays out all the powers of the president. And so in this section of the Constitution, it says that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And the president usually means this to read that he's responsible for the executive branch, that he should be the head of the executive branch, and that he should do whatever it takes to make sure that the executive branch does its job, and that the executive branch is going to implement policies, and it's going to execute the law. And a lot of times the president is going to object to the law that Congress passed based on these grounds, saying that Congress, the section that you provided, for me, it gets in my way of faithfully executing the law. I have to mention you're going to notice these are very vague language from the Constitution. The president counts on that. And so that way the president can construct these different arguments based on these sort of vague languages. He can sort of push his power a little bit further. And so from this clause of the Constitution, the president usually invokes what we call in political science as the unitary executive theory. And under this theory, the president asserts that he is the sole head of the executive branch and that he should have sole control of the executive branch. And nothing is going to get in the president's way of controlling the executive branch and making sure that the executive branch does its job. And as a result, the president asserts that he has the authority to interpret the Constitution, And so I just want to note that this is kind of controversial, because if you look at the Constitution, it says that the judiciary branch, the courts, are supposed to be responsible for interpreting the Constitution. But the president says, since I have the responsibility of implementing laws, I should also have the ability, and I should also have the power to interpret the Constitution. Not just the courts, but me. And as a result, the president asserts that if he thinks that something is unconstitutional, if he thinks that a law that Congress passed is unconstitutional, then he is not bound to follow that law. Again, because he has the independent authority to interpret the Constitution himself. And so this theory is something evoked by a lot of presidents as justification for why they can make these objections to the law, and why they can issue signing statements. Because they have this power to say what is constitutional and what's not, and therefore they have this responsibility to issue these signing statements to object to the law based on constitutional grounds. So is all of that clear so far? I just dropped a lot of theory on you. Does anybody have any questions up at this point?
Since you're discussing that, there's the unwritten constitution that goes all the way back, where presidents do certain things, and those after the thing, is that the unwritten constitution?
So you're talking more about maybe the precedent that previous presidents leave behind. So that's certainly taken into consideration, but we've seen plenty of times that the courts have struck down even some sorts of precedents that the president has left behind. But this theory here specifically deals with the things that the president is drawing from the written Constitution. That's what we're talking about here. Any other questions? Yes.
So, when you say the president can decide to not follow a certain law or whatever is happening, is that just the same as an individual, or can you only enforce on it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you make. I see what you mean. So when he says he's bound to not follow it, so we know that when Congress passes a law, the executive branch as a whole is responsible for implementing that law. It basically responsible for making that law policy that we all follow. The president is the head of the executive branch. So when he says that he's not going to follow a law, that means he's going to tell the executive branch not to implement that law, not to enforce that law. Does that answer your question? Excellent. Any other questions? Okay, so let's move on. So another common objection that the president uses in signing statements is that the signing statement, or the law that the Congress has passed, is getting in his way of commander-in-chief, this constitutional role of the president being commander-in-chief. And this is drawn again from Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, where it says the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. So this means that the president is head of the military. And basically in these signing statements, a lot of the times he says that this section that Congress has passed, it's getting in the way of me being the head of the military. It's getting in the way of these powers that the Constitution gives me. And so I'm not going to follow it. A lot of times, and particularly in this post 9/11 world that we live in, this extends to national security issues. So in George W. Bush's administration, we see him connecting his role as commander-in-chief into these arguments about sort of expanding his national security role and doing things in the interest of our national security. And so this is something, and I'll show you some examples in a second of how exactly this is the case. But a lot of the times the president is going to evoke this sort of language that I'm the commander-in-chief, this law gets in my way of being a commander-in-chief, and so I'm not going to listen to it. And so finally, the final section of the Constitution the president often brings up when objecting to the law is the presentment clause. And basically this presentment clause, and this is going to be in Article 1 of the Constitution. And if you remember, Article 1 is the part of the Constitution that lays out all the powers of Congress. And in Section 7, Clauses 2 and 3, it basically lays out how a bill is to become a law. So something that the video that you just saw, basically this chart that I just showed you, the Constitution lays out this process. And so in recent years, kind of earlier in the 20th century, I should say, Congress tried to evoke a legislative veto And before I tell you what that is, just notice nowhere on this chart does it say Congress has a legislative veto. It says the president can veto, but it doesn't say Congress can veto. And this legislative veto is the ability of Congress to overturn actions of the executive branch, actions that the executive branch is trying to do in order to implement the law. Now, I should note the Supreme Court overturned this type of veto. It said that Congress can't do this anymore because this was in violation of the Constitution. Specifically, it was in violation of this presentment clause because, again, it looked to the Constitution. It said nowhere in the Constitution does it say that Congress should have this veto. So the Supreme Court says Congress can't do this anymore. And I just want to give you an idea of what a legislative veto looks like. So after Congress passes a bill, it gives out certain instructions to agencies. The president signs the bill into law, and then the executive branch is responsible for implementing that law into actual policy. And this last step is going to be the legislative veto. So after the executive branch does some sort of action to implement that policy, Congress can review those actions of the executive branch. At least that's what they think they can do with the legislative veto. So they can either approve those actions of the executive branch, say that's okay, you're doing a good job, or it can reject these actions and tell them to try again. This is exactly what a legislative veto is. Again, since it was nowhere in this process of how a bill becomes a law in the Constitution, the Supreme Court ruled that unconstitutional. So Congress can't do this anymore. So a lot of times in legislation that Congress passes, even though the Supreme Court said you can't do this, Congress still tries to sneak that into legislation. And presidents will issue signing statements to say, hey guys, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. The court said it's unconstitutional. So I'm going to sign this signing statement telling you that you can't do this. And because it's unconstitutional, I'm going to object to it. So this is another grounds for objection that presidents use in signing statements. But you might be thinking this is kind of ironic, right? The president says legislative vetoes aren't in the Constitution. It's not in this process. But you may be thinking, well, signing statements aren't in the Constitution. Signing statements aren't part of this process either. So let me tell you how signing statements are a bit outside of this process and why some people think signing statements themselves are unconstitutional, for similar reasons to why people think legislative vetoes are unconstitutional. So I'm sounding like a broken record, but I want to make sure that everyone gets this. This is how my students have to endure this too, so you do too. So when Congress passes a law, it's going to give instructions to the executive branch on how to implement this law. The president signs the bill into law, but as I noted before, he can issue a signing statement that also gives instructions. And this signing statement will give instructions to the executive branch as well. And again, a lot of people argue that signing statements, since they're not in the process of how a bill becomes a law in the Constitution, that these signing statements should also be unconstitutional. Of course, the president doesn't mention that in signing statements. That would defeat the purpose. But these are one reason why people think signing statements are unconstitutional, because it violates this presentment clause that I just mentioned. Oh yeah, I forgot I put these animations in. Question mark, are signing statements unconstitutional? It's a debate. It's not. We're not sure if they are or not, but there are certainly arguments on both sides. Any questions about any of what I just said? Again, I dropped a lot of things on you. Yes, in the back, please.
Yes. Has the signing statements ever been challenged in front of the Supreme Court?
So no, signing statements have not been challenged in front of the Supreme Court. One reason why, and just in general, presidential actions are hard to challenge in courts, because when you bring a case to a court in front of the court, you have to claim some sort of standing to bring that case to court. And it's very hard to bring standing against an action of the president, especially when these presidential actions are aimed towards agencies within the executive branch and not you and me particularly. So it's hard to claim standing to sue the president on those sorts of grounds. But later on the talk, I'm going to tell you how the president actually issues signing statements to influence the court. This is where the talk is going. But I should also mention there have been efforts by Congress to try to restrict the use of signing statements for presidents. Some things that were not successful. They tried in 2006, but it was unsuccessful. Any other questions at this point? All right. So now I'm going to give you a few examples of what constitutional signing statements look like. Again, these are the signing statements where the president objects to the law based on constitutional grounds. So this is a signing statement that President Obama issued in 2011 to an appropriations bill that Congress passed. And in the signing statement, he says several provisions in this bill, and he goes on to list a lot of these provisions, that's where the ... comes in, could prevent me from fulfilling my constitutional responsibilities. He goes on to say it's gonna get in my way of kind of controlling the executive branch, something that I have control over. And then as a result, he says, I will interpret these provisions consistent to my constitutional duty to take care that the law be faithfully executed. So you see that the president is objecting to the signing statement. Objecting to the law. He's saying Congress passed this law that somehow gets in my way of controlling the executive branch, gets in my way of faithfully executing the law. So I'm going to interpret it in a way that's going to be consistent with the Constitution. So that's a very, very vague, roundabout way of the president saying that I don't agree with this section, and so I'm going to basically ignore it. But he uses it in a more eloquent language. So the second example, another signing statement issued by President Obama in 2009. Again, he objects to some sort of part of the law based on a section of the Constitution. And then I just want to bring your attention to this very last phrase in the signing statement. He said, I shall treat these directions as precatory. So basically what that means, he's saying that I'm going to treat this section that Congress passed as advisory. So he's basically saying, Congress passed this law. I don't necessarily feel I have to actually follow it. I'm just going to kind of take it as a suggestion or take it into in advisement. Again, another roundabout, flowery way of the president saying, I'm going to ignore this section of the law because I don't agree with it. And this language is very, very common in signing statements. It's a very common way of the president saying that he's going to object to the law. So I want to give you one final example of a constitutional signing statement, and I'm going to kind of draw out this example a little bit and give you some context. But I just want to note that this example I'm going to show you is the reason why people know what signing statements are today. It's the reason why signing statements have been getting a lot of attention starting in the Bush administration because of this example. So in 2005, Congress passed the Defense Appropriations Act. And in this act, John McCain introduced this amendment called the Detainee Treatment Act. It was an amendment within this larger act. And in this amendment, it specified that the United States could not have any inhumane treatment of prisoners that it was keeping in its custody. So basically what this says in so many words is this was an anti-torture amendment. It's saying that the United States cannot torture its prisoners anymore. And this was a very salient, very controversial amendment at the time because, again, we're in this post-9/11 world, this heightened national security after 9/11, where it was controversial the way that the United States was treating prisoners at this time. Then this was during a time where George W. Bush was pushing his national security powers a little bit further. So obviously, George W. Bush opposed this amendment to this act. He wanted to keep in place his power to be able to torture prisoners, or the government to be able to torture prisoners. And he threatened to veto it, which is what we'd expect, right? When a president objects to the law, he says he's going to veto that bill, right? Except, remember that I told you at the very beginning that Congress has the ability to override the veto if they have large enough numbers. He saw that there was a huge support for this amendment in Congress. More than 2/3 of Congress supported this amendment. So if the president vetoed the bill, he knew that Congress has enough people in support of the bill that his veto would be overridden and the bill would become a law anyway. So he knows that the veto is not going to work. So what else can he do? Well, he decides that he's going to issue a signing statement instead. And in the signing statement, he's going to state his objections to that particular section. That's going to be the way that the president is going to oppose this bill without having to use a veto, especially since he knew that the veto was not going to last. So this is the signing statement that the president issued instead of the veto. And in the signing statement, he's saying that the executive branch shall construe Title X in Division A. And this specific section, this was the section dealing with the torture, in a manner consistent with the constitutional authority of the president to supervise the unitary executive branch and consistent with his powers as commander-in-chief. So basically what he's saying is this section that Congress is trying to pass, this amendment that says that's outlawing torture, this is getting in the way of my ability to be commander-in-chief. And therefore, I'm going to construe it, or I'm going to interpret it in a different way. Again, hopefully you're kind of picking up on the language presidents are using, that this is a way of the president saying, I don't like this section, I think it limits my power, I'm not going to listen to it. So as a result of this signing statement, there was a lot of media attention surrounding Bush's use of this statement. And in particular, a reporter from the Boston Globe, Charlie Savage, he started writing a series of articles about Bush's use of this particular signing statement and about Bush's use of signing statements in general. And because of this series of articles, one, he won a Pulitzer Prize for it. That's pretty awesome. And two, it brought a lot of attention to the president's use of signing statements. Before then, people had never heard of the phrase signing statements, most people. But now, a lot of attention has been given to signing statements, and it painted George W. Bush as basically an imperial president, expanding his powers beyond the Constitution, basically painting him to be a tyrant and pushing his presidential power to beyond the limits of the Constitution. So a lot of attention brought in after the president's use of this signing statement. So that leads us to the second part, the second question I told you we were going to answer, and that is who have used signing statements over time. So I'm going to lay out two myths for you, myths that we hear about in the media a lot, and I'm going to tell you how they're not true. This is why they're called myths. The first myth is George W. Bush was the first president to use signing statements. So a lot of people thought this because they hadn't heard what a signing statement was before this particular signing statement I just mentioned. And a lot of media attention was associating signing statements to the name George W. Bush. So people just didn't know if there were any presidents even beforehand that issued signing statements. So they just assumed that President Bush was the first to issue signing statements. Well, I'm going to show you that this is not true. So this figure shows the number of signing statements by all presidents and how many signing statements each president has used over time. And as we see here, in the beginning years, they weren't really used. I have to say, President Monroe was the first president to issue signing statements in 1821. He issued a couple. And in the earlier presidents, they were used kind of infrequently, but they were still used. And then when we get into the more modern presidents, so beginning with FDR, Truman, they're beginning to issue signing statements a lot more. But basically, the point of this figure is just to show you that President Bush was not the first president to issue signing statements. James Monroe was. Trivia question. I'm going to ask you that at the end. Okay. Myth 2. Well, okay, so maybe George W. Bush wasn't the first president to issue a signing statement, but he certainly issued the most signing statements, right? I mean, we have all this media attention talking about Bush's excessive use of signing statements. I'm going to show you a video of, and pay close attention to, in this video where they talk about how Bush has used far more signing statements than any other president. So let me show you this.
Time for a couple of underreported holy mackerel stories in today's news. First up, one thing that Constitution huggers like me actually find sort of lovable about John McCain as compared with Barack Obama is McCain's insistence that he would not issue signing statements. Obama says he would if the need arose. A quick refresher on signing statements. That's when a president signs a bill into law but issues a statement to go along with it saying he doesn't plan on enforcing some parts of that law. Because he's the president, and he says so. It sounds bushy, right? Well, it is. Before George W. Bush, all presidents combined issued about 600 of these things in all of American history. George W. Bush has almost doubled that total personally. On Tuesday, Bush issued 2 more signing statements. One weakened a new law to protect independent watchdog inspectors at federal agencies from political interference. That's nice. You wouldn't want that. The other one took Congress's idea for an Iraq policy and stole its soul. The last military spending bill Congress passed said the U.S. government could not use any of that funding to, quote, exercise United States control of the oil resources of Iraq. That's what Bush's signing statement overrode. So Congress said, even though we're occupying Iraq, we can't steal their oil. And Bush said, I'm the president, and I'll do what I want with Iraq's oil. Signing statements. Set yourself a Google News alert on that little bit of power-grabbing imperial evil. And good on John McCain for saying he would never issue one.
So this very pessimistic language of signing statements, as depicted in this Rachel Maddow video, is very typical of the way signing statements were being depicted, especially George W. Bush's language of signing statements, the way that was depicted. A very negative, pessimistic outlook that is expansion of presidential power. But what I wanted you to pay special attention to is that Rachel Maddow said that previous presidents had issued about 600 altogether, and Bush single-handedly doubled the number of signing statements presidents has used, implying that he's issued way more, double than all other presidents combined. And this is the typical image that people had of signing statements, that Bush issued way more than any other president. But this isn't exactly true. So I'm going to show you the number of signing statements for just modern presidents so that we can really kind of hone in on Bush and his contemporaries. And as you can see, a lot of previous presidents, and most other previous presidents, had issued more signing statements than George W. Bush had. So George W. Bush issued about 160. And if you notice in the Rachel Maddow video, she implied that he's issued about 1,200 of them. So that's not true, but I'll show you where she was getting that from. So Clinton issued way more than that. He was issuing closer to 400. His dad, H.W. Bush, issued more than that. Reagan, Carter, all these different presidents issued more signing statements than George W. Bush had. So why are people getting this image that Bush is using this power excessively, way more than any other president? So now I gave you 2 myths. Now let me give you the truth. And this is the only truth I'm going to drop on you today. And this truth is that while George W. Bush didn't issue more signing statements in terms of the number of signing statements, he has objected to more sections of the law than any other president. So we can count the number of signing statements. That's one way to kind of reflect how the president's using them. But we can also look at the content of those signing statements. And we look at the content and look at how many sections of the law the president is actually objecting to within these signing statements. We can see that George W. Bush issued way more objections than any other president. And so we're going to define objections here as the number of sections of the law that the president objects to within a signing statement. And when we count those number of objections, we see that the president has issued close to 1,200. This is the number that Rachel Maddow was coming up with. Close to 1,200. And as we can see, that far surpasses any other president's use of signing statements in terms of the number of objections. So in that way, this is where people are getting that Bush has used signing statements excessively as compared to any other president. But in terms of just the sheer number of signing statements, he's issued actually fewer. But in terms of objections within signing statements to the law, he's issued way more. So that's just a point of clarification you should keep in mind when you talk to your friends about signing statements, which I know you all will. Okay, and so one final thing I want to show you. So if you also remember in that Rachel Maddow video, she was very, very proud that John McCain vowed that he would never, ever use signing statements. This is a wonderful thing. I also want to note that President Obama, before he was president, when he was campaigning to be president, remember this is during the time where George W. Bush was still president and signing statements was a very controversial thing. Candidate Obama also vowed never to issue any signing statements. And I just want to take a look at this video.
When Congress offers you a bill, do you promise not to use presidential signage to get your way?
Yes. Let me just explain for those who are unfamiliar with this issue. We've got a government designed by the founders so that there'd be checks and balances. You don't want a president who's too powerful, or a Congress who's too powerful, or a courts who's too powerful. Everybody's got their own role. Congress's job is to pass legislation. The president can veto it or he can sign it. But what George Bush has been trying to do as part of his effort to accumulate more power in the presidency is he's been saying, well, I can basically change what Congress passed by attaching a letter saying, I don't agree with this part or I don't agree with that part. I'm going to choose to interpret it this way or that way. That's not part of his power. But this is part of the whole theory of George Bush, that he can make laws as he's going along. I disagree with that. I taught the Constitution for 10 years. I believe in the Constitution, and I will obey the Constitution of the United States. We're not going to use signing statements as a way of doing an end run around Congress. All right?
So candidate Obama vows never to issue signing statements, but let's take a look back at this chart. Oh, he has issued signing statements. That's right, he has. So that begs the question, well, why do presidents use signing statements anyway, at all? So President Obama really was risking something when he was issuing signing statements, especially since it's on public record that he said he wasn't going to issue any signing statements. So why do presidents use them at all? And so there were two implications of signing statements that give reason to why presidents would use them. And I've already talked about the first one. I'm going to kind of nail it in your head again. But then the rest of the talk is going to focus on basically the second point. So one, signing statements can influence the implementation of the law. And again, this is through the instructions that the presidents give to the executive branch on how presidents want them to influence the law. The second way signing statements can influence the law is that signing statements also influence the interpretation of the law by the courts. So when presidents issue signing statements, they're basically making a public record of how they think the law should be interpreted. And I'm going to argue to you that they want the courts to pay attention to their interpretation. This is something that I'm going to get to the last part of this talk. But for now, I'm going to show you this chart again. I'm sorry, but I want to make another point. Hopefully you're getting this, that you can talk me through this actually now. So when Congress passes a bill into law, it gives a set of instructions to agencies on how to implement the law. We're going to give that set of instructions, we're going to give that a name A. So Congress gives a set of instructions A to the executive branch on how they want that executive branch to implement the law. The president can sign the bill into law and can issue a signing statement. And he can issue his own set of instructions to the executive branch about how he wants that law to be implemented. We're going to call that set of instructions B. So when the executive branch sits down to implement the law, and when they do this, they're basically writing regulations on how we should follow the law as people, they can either sit down and listen to the set of instructions A that Congress recommended, or the set of instructions B that presidents recommended. So they have two different sets of instructions on how to implement the law. So the question is, well, which set should I listen to, especially since these two sets of instructions are probably conflicting, which is the reason why the president issued the signing statement in the first place. So the president would argue that the executive branch shouldn't listen to this first set of instructions because the president, being the head of the executive branch, has the power to tell the executive branch what to do. So therefore, the executive branch should listen to his set of instructions. And since presidents have all sorts of powers to control the executive branch, this is more likely to happen. So punchline here, signing statements can influence the implementation of the law through the instructions that the president gives to agencies within the executive branch. You should have this memorized by now. Next is going to be, I'm going to show you the way that signing statements influence the interpretation of the law. So when Congress passes a bill, it's basically stating how it wants the law to be interpreted. Presidents can sign the bill into law and can issue a signing statement, offering its own set of interpretations of the law. So Congress passes the bill with interpretation X, we're going to call, and then signing statements issued by presidents are issued with interpretation Y. And then when the courts review law and try to interpret the law, because that's their constitutional role is to interpret the law, they can either go with interpretation X, which is what Congress states in the legislation, or interpretation Y, which is from what the president states in signing statements. And again, it's a question of which interpretation should the courts listen to. Now, it's a little less clear about which interpretation the courts are actually going to listen to. As I showed you, for agencies, it's more clear, since the president's head of the executive branch, that the executive branch should listen to the president, or at least that's what the president thinks. But the courts are supposed to be being an independent body. It's uncertain about what set of instructions the courts are going to listen to. So punchline here, signing statements influence the interpretation of the law by providing the president's position on the law to the courts, by providing the president's interpretation of the law in these signing statements that the courts could listen to. So just a review of the constitutional roles of each branch of government. I'm going to tell you how the president inserts himself in all of these roles with his use of signing statements. So from the Constitution, it says that Congress should have the responsibility of making law, or basically writing what the law is. The executive branch, with the president being the head of the executive branch, has the role of enforcing the law, basically implementing that law into policy that we follow as people. And finally, the courts have the role of interpreting the law, basically saying what the law means. So these are three distinct roles that the Constitution lays out for each branch of the government. And this is basically the separation of powers principle established in the Constitution. Each branch has its own set of powers. So signing statements give presidents the ability to enforce the law or implement the law, again with their instructions to the executive branch on how to implement the law. But signing statements can do even more. It can give presidents the ability to write the law, at least that's what some people argue, because the president has the ability to pick and choose what parts of the law that he's going to listen to. So in a lot of ways, people say that the president is really actually writing the law. He's picking parts of the law and piecing them together to write his own law. And this is something that a role the Constitution gives to the Congress. And finally, signing statements can give the president's ability to interpret the law. Again, these are statements where the president is stating his interpretation of the law. This is a power reserved for the courts in the Constitution. And so a lot of times, people will say that this is the president trying to expand his powers into these other two branches of government. So, as a result, presidents can expand the power of the president. And a lot of times, because the president has the ability to do these other things that these other branches of government are supposed to do under the Constitution, people see signing statements as a violation of this separation of powers principle that I laid out on the previous slide of the Constitution. Because, again, it gives the president the ability to write the law and also interpret the law. Roles the Constitution reserves for the other branches of government. So this is the main reason why people see signing statements as unconstitutional. It's the president's ability to expand his power into the other branches of government. Okay, so our last question that we're going to answer is when or how do presidents use signing statements? So under what conditions are we more likely to see the president using signing statements? So one, political scientists, and a lot of political scientists are interested in this question about when presidents use signing statements, when we see them use signing statements. I'm one of them. This is something I'm interested in. But a lot of political scientists find that presidents issue more signing statements under divided government. And divided government is those times, and this is probably all that we know now, this is all that we see divided government. But basically when the president is from one political party and Congress is from another political party. So we have currently under divided government, the president being a Democrat, and Congress, especially after this most recent election, all of Congress are Republicans, the majority of Congress. So this is a case of divided government. So we see presidents issuing more signing statements under divided government. So I'm going to ask one of you to tell me, why do we think that this is the case, that presidents issue more signing statements under divided government? Does this make sense at all? Any sort of intuition why you think presidents would do that? Yes, please. Right, exactly. So basically, what this very bright young woman up front was saying is that under divided government, we're more likely to have the president and Congress offering conflicting interpretations of the law. They're going to be on different pages. They're more likely to not agree about what the law should be, what policy should be. So therefore, the president is more likely to take the opportunity to issue signing statements to say what the law is. Because again, under divided government, they're more likely to disagree with Congress. And so the president can more likely use this tool to combat a conflicting Congress, to say what the law is. So does that make sense? So I tell my class when I teach, I ask them these questions all the time, that I'm going to need some nodding to let me know that it's okay to move on. So does this make sense? Excellent. I have to prompt them all the time. And maybe they're not paying attention, so I have to have them nod to make sure that I know that they're paying attention as well. Okay. So these are the conditions where the president thinks about what Congress is doing, and that is going to allow him to determine when he should use signing statements. But the question that I ask in my research is, what about the courts? Do the presidents think about the courts when presidents decide how to issue signing statements? The short answer is yes, but I'm going to show you exactly how they do that. Remember I showed you this, 2 ways signing statements can influence the law. We're going to focus on this one, and remind you that signing statements can influence the interpretation of the law. I'll show you this figure again. Remember, presidents with signing statements can offer the president's own interpretation of the law that the courts can consider when they're interpreting the law. And therefore, the president wants to issue these signing statements because he wants the courts to consider his position on the law. That's exactly what I said, so I won't repeat that. Second, so okay, maybe I will review because it's a nice segue. Okay, so one, signing statements, presidents want the courts to listen to their interpretation of the law when the courts are deciding how exactly to interpret the law. And courts actually do this because signing statements are now included in legislative histories. And what legislative histories are, it's basically a record of all the proceedings of how a bill becomes a law. And the courts usually look to legislative histories to try to determine, well, what exactly did Congress mean when they were trying to write the law? What was the intent of Congress behind the law? So now that signing statements are included in legislative histories, that means that the courts not only look to these legislative histories to determine what Congress's intent of the law, what Congress's meaning of the law is, but also what the president's meaning of the law is. So it recognizes that the president should have his own interpretation of the law as well. So we know that one, not only do presidents want to offer their interpretation to the courts of the law, but that the courts actually listen to these interpretations because it's part of the official record of this intent behind the law. And again, when courts are reviewing legislation in different cases, they look to these legislative histories to figure out the intent of the law when they're trying to interpret the law. So I'm going to lay out this argument for how this translates into the way the presidents use signing statements when they're thinking about the courts. So one, not only do presidents want the courts to look at their interpretation of the law, but they want the courts to actually side with their interpretation of the law. They want the courts to say, hey, we see the president's interpretation of the law, the signing statements, and we agree with him. The presidents want that. On the other hand, the president does not want to issue a signing statement if he thinks that the court is not going to side with his position. This looks bad for him. He doesn't want the courts to ever come out and say that they're against his position. So when he knows that the courts are not going to side with his interpretation, then he doesn't want to issue a signing statement. So then that raises the question, how exactly does the president know when the courts are likely to side with his position? So we have to take a step back and think about how exactly courts decide cases. And so there are 2 ways that courts decide cases. One, they decided on the law. This is the most unsurprising point that I've given you. 2, courts also decide cases based on their ideology or their political preferences. This may also be another unsurprising point. But basically, especially in this current political climate that we're in, and we see a lot of court cases being politically motivated. So we see cases on abortion, we see cases on gay marriage. A lot of these are political issues, and a lot of the justices themselves have their own ideology that helps them decide, and that they use their ideology in deciding cases. And we see this a lot of times, and more, especially in recent years. So the president knows that a court that shares his ideology is going to be more likely to side with his position. And again, this is because if you have a liberal president and a liberal court, they're more likely to agree on a certain set of political issues. They most likely are able to share their opinions. And so the president knows that if he faces a liberal court, being a liberal president, that the court is more likely to uphold what the president wants. Okay? And so the president is more likely then to issue a signing statement when he knows that the court is likely to side with his position. And this occurs when the court shares his ideology. So the main takeaway, the main punchline from these couple of slides is that I predict that the president is going to issue more signing statements when he shares the ideology of the court. So I'm going to show you some evidence to show you why I'm right. Are there any questions up to this point? Again, I laid a lot of just theory on you. Are there any questions? Does this make sense? This is the part where I need head nods if it makes sense or not. If it doesn't make sense, please tell me. I don't want to lose anybody, just like I'm losing these people probably going to class right now. Okay. So let me show you some evidence. So I'm going to give you two case studies. We're going to compare the signing statements President George W. Bush issued, compare that to signing statements Obama issued, and I'm going to show you the position of the Supreme Court, our highest court in the land, and show you how that influenced the way they issued signing statements. So let's start with George W. Bush. George W. Bush is a Republican president. And this is the Supreme Court that he faced mostly. So we see that there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and when George W. Bush was in office, especially towards the later part of his term, there were 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And we can use the political party as a proxy for ideologies, so arguing that Republicans are more conservative, Democrats are more liberal. So here, with a mostly Republican court, this is a mostly conservative court. And so we see, since George W. Bush is conservative, this is a court that's in his favor. The majority of the people on the court are from his same party, are conservatives. And so as a result, we see Bush using a lot of signing statements. And so on average, he issues about 20 signing statements per year. And I break that down by type as well. And he's issuing about 143 objections per year. Now keep those numbers in mind, because I'm going to contrast that to Obama, who faces a different type of court because he's a liberal instead of a conservative. So Barack Obama, who's a Democrat, this is the current court that he faces. While he did have the opportunity to appoint a couple members of the Supreme Court of his same party, for the most part, the majority of the court is still Republican. So as a result, this is a situation where the court is not in his favor. The court is from a different ideology. And so, under the prediction that I told you before, we should expect Barack Obama to issue fewer signing statements because he's faced with an opposition court, a court not likely to side with his position. And this is exactly what we see. Whereas we saw George W. Bush, who's faced with a friendly court towards him, issue 20 signing statements per year, we see President Obama right now averaging about 4 signing statements per year and 12 objections per year, whereas George W. Bush issued about 143 objections per year. So the punchline here, George W. Bush was faced with a court that had his same ideology, and so he was able to issue more signing statements. And then President Obama, faced with a court from an opposing ideology, issued fewer signing statements. Again, he saw that this court was more likely to not side with his position, so he scaled back the number of signing statements that he used. At least this is what I argue. Let me give you a little bit more systematic evidence. So I'm going to show you the average number of signing statements that presidents use when they're aligned with the court versus when they're divided from the court, so when they don't share an ideology with the court. And this is going to be all presidents from 1953 to 2012, so we're looking more past just these two presidents that I showed you, but all presidents since Eisenhower. And as we can see, when the president is from the same ideology of the Supreme Court, and this is the red bars, we see that presidents on average issue more signing statements than those presidents that face courts that are from opposing ideologies. And so we see this with every president since 1953. And here we're looking the top set of bars, look at all signing statements, the middle set constitutional signing statements, and then the bottom set are constitutional objections, the number of sections they object to. So this gives us more evidence to show that presidents are more likely to issue signing statements or issue more signing statements when they are from the same ideology or the same political party as the Supreme Court. Because these are the times they know that the court is more likely to be on their side. This is the times where they know they can push a little bit further with their power because the courts are more likely to uphold what they're doing. And so the last thing I'm going to show you is the case of George H.W. Bush and him making a Supreme Court appointment in the middle of his term. And he makes this appointment where he replaces a Democratic justice with a Republican justice. And this is going to shift the ideology of the court in a more Republican direction. And so from what we predicted before, we should expect that the president should issue more signing statements after the shift in the ideology of the court. So after he makes his appointment and the courts are more in his favor, we should see presidents issue more signing statements after this appointment. And I'm going to compare the numbers of signing statements that George H.W. issued before and after this Supreme Court appointment. So before the appointment, he issued about 59 constitutional signing statements with 37 objections. After this appointment, where the court is more conservative, he's issuing more signing statements, 123 more signing statements, and 44 more objections that he's issued after this appointment. So again, that gives us some evidence that even when we hold the president constant and we see a shift in the court towards the president's ideology, the court becomes more on the president's side, we see presidents adjusting their behavior and the president's actually issuing more signing statements. And the final thing, we can contrast that to Jimmy Carter. Poor Jimmy Carter, he was not able to appoint anyone to the Supreme Court. So there was no shift in ideology. Oh yeah, big red no. So we can compare numbers of signing statements in the first part of his term and the second part of the term. Since there was no shift in the Supreme Court towards his ideology, we should expect these numbers to be pretty similar. And this is exactly what we see. So in his first half of the term, he issued 12 signing statements. In the second half, 13 signing statements, so virtually no difference. And then the number of objections, he actually issued fewer objections in the second part of his term than the first part of this term. And this is what we expect because we see no shift in the court's ideology. And so going back to the last part of this talk, and that's readdressing these 4 big questions. What are signing statements? Something I told you. Written pronouncements by presidents commenting on the law. Who have used signing statements? I was going to ask you who was the first president to use signing statements. Anybody remember? Yes. So many people said that. Yes, you're all right, Monroe. Good job. And more recently, presidents since Truman have consistently used signing statements. Finally, almost finally, why do presidents use signing statements? 1, to implement the law, and 2, to interpret the law. And finally, when or how do presidents use signing statements? And I argue that presidents use more signing statements when they're from the same ideology or the same political party as the Supreme Court. How much time, what time is it? 5 minutes? Okay, I was gonna show you this video, but I'm just going to pivot to questions now. But you should go look this up. Colbert has some funny comments about signing statements. So are there any questions? Yes, please.
I'm wondering how these numbers might be different. Instead of looking at the absolute number of signing statements, percentage of bills that the president signs had signing statements attached. When I look at President Obama's numbers, it's hard to attach a signing statement when nobody's passing a bill, which is, for the last 4 years, he's had virtually nothing on his desk to sign. It would be interesting to look at how the numbers bear out on a percentage basis as opposed to an absolute number.
That is a great question. So in recent years, not Obama, but Congress has been passing an embarrassingly low number of laws as compared to previous Congresses. So the question is, we should account for the fact that Congress is passing fewer laws, and maybe that's why presidents are issuing fewer signing statements. Without boring you guys too much with the details, I have looked at this, and it still holds. We still see, even looking at the rates that presidents are issuing signing statements on by each bill that's passed into law, we still see the same sorts of patterns. One more question, yes, in the back.
Yeah, thank you. So even with conservative control of the courts, with Republican control of the Congress, do you expect President Obama to issue more signing statements within these last 2 years of the presidency?
Right, so that's a little bit more of a complicated question, but you do have to think about exactly how presidents issue signing statements when thinking about not only the courts, but also Congress. And in the research that I do, I actually argue that this is a conditional relationship and that these certain conditions must hold. And so I told you before that presidents, in the previous literature, presidents issue more signing statements when faced with divided government. But what I actually find is that the relationship to the courts are greater, and that kind of overrides this. So the president can only issue these signing statements to get around Congress in this way, only conditional on when he's close to the courts. So really, I find that this relationship with the courts is sort of even stronger predictor of when we should see signing statements than his relationship with Congress. And I think that's all the time we have for questions, and I thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to answer any more.